Hello, Cor Unum cohort. This is Rita, Rebecca, and Julie, and we are presenting our exegesis on Isaiah chapter 40, verses 1 to 24. We hope you enjoy. On this slide and the next slide, you will see our pericope written for you. Please take some time to read it, and later in our presentation, we will read it out loud along with some analysis.
Central issue in Isaiah chapter 40, verses 1 through 24. The theme of 2nd Isaiah is very different than the theme of 1st Isaiah, which were of threat and condemnation. 2nd Isaiah focuses on consolation and hope. The author recognizes that the people must be consoled and not punished, and that their faith should no longer be tried. The people are about to witness the manifestation of God's redeeming presence. Those who have known God's covenant with their ancestors are now called to proclaim the good news.
The thesis of our exegesis is that the passage proclaims a salvific message of comfort and hope to reaffirm God's sovereign power to a nation that has lost its homeland and its relationship with the Lord. Our following presentation will provide support for this thesis.
Contextual analysis of Isaiah chapter 40. The historical context. Chapter 40 through 55 are commonly dated to 540 BC, just at the moment when the rising Persian Empire displaced the brutal and hatred domination of Babylon. The gap between chapters 39 and chapter 40 have been estimated to be around 160 years. Contextual analysis of Isaiah. Literary context. The literary context of the book Isaiah has been divided into three: 1st Isaiah, 2nd Isaiah, and 3rd Isaiah. 2nd Isaiah, chapter 40, is divided into different parts. Verses 1 through 11 in chapter 40 function as a prologue and the climax. The primary role of the prologue is to announce God's new purpose for Israel in bringing forth totally new redemptive events on its behalf, which serve as evidence for the faithfulness of God's word standing forever. The structure of chapter 40, verses 12 through 31, can be viewed as following. Verses 12 through 17, no one can gauge God's work. Verse 12, not in creation. Verses 13 through 14, not in council, and verses 15 through 17, not among the nations. Verses 18 through 24, no one compare, proof given.
Now let's move on to the formal analysis of our pericope, where we'll talk about the form, structure, and translation of the passage. We'll start with the form, and our passage is written in poetic form. It contains beautiful poetry written with very beautiful and scenic imagery, as well as poetic language. Within the poetic form, there are two additional forms identified. In verses 1 to 11, the form is an adapted call narrative. It's a call narrative because it describes the commission or call of a prophet. It's adapted rather than completely traditional call narrative because whereas a traditional call narrative, God directly speaks to the prophet and directly calls the prophet. In this case, the call is made by many voices thought by some scholars to be a heavenly council. And the heavenly council is thought to be usual members of a council, officials, as well as a solo voice, possibly an official of the council, and God's voice. God is speaking with these anonymous voices, and the voice of the actual prophet is really only vaguely present. Within the commission or call, there are three commands given. One is to comfort Jerusalem, one is to speak consoling words, and the last to proclaim the good news. In verses 12 to 24 of our pericope, we see a different form being used, that of a disputation speech. It's not a purely authentic disputation speech, but has many of the characteristics of that form. In our passage, the words are spoken in a voice that is not God's, and it contains a series of rhetorical questions which are not directly answered, but questions to which the answers are inferred. There's some resemblance in this disputation speech to Job, chapters 38 to 41, where again there's a whirlwind of questions. But in that case, it's more directly disputational because God is directly asking the questions, whereas in our passage, the questions are asked by this series of other voices. We see two important characteristics in the form of our pericope. The first is that there's a lack of definition of the speakers and of the person who's called. And so this creates an invitation to broaden the context for additional interpretations. It creates a sense of a lack of specificity in being able to identify exactly who is talking and who is receiving the message. And this allows us to maybe apply that situation to our current situation or to broaden the interpretation from um, that setting to put possibly other settings as well. Secondly, the voice of the prophet has really faded into the background of the pericope. Other voices speak, God speaks, but the voice of the prophet is only vaguely present in the passage. And this is a new way or a new form of prophetic mediation where the prophet isn't the one so clearly proclaiming the message. And that is an important characteristic of this pericope. In analyzing the structure of our pericope, we find two units composing the pericope. The first unit is verses 1 through 11, where again there are multiple voices speaking in a heavenly court. And the focus is more on the relationship between Yahweh and Jerusalem or Zion. In Unit 2, which composes the remainder of our passage and some additional verses beyond that, in verses 12 to 31, we again see this series of rhetorical questions. And the content is more concretely relatable context and emotion related to the Judeans in the Babylonian exile. There's some Babylonian theology that's set as a backdrop to the sovereign power of Yahweh as well, and that forms the second unit. Also seen in the second unit is an arched pattern to the verses, which begin and end with the positive message that Yahweh is coming according to his own plan. So in verses 10 and 11, we see the phrase, see, Yahweh is coming with power. His strong arm affirms his rule. And then again at verse 28, we see the phrase, Yahweh is God from of old. He neither faints nor grows weary. And these two are seen as two ends of an arched pattern that repeat the same message both at the beginning and the end of that passage. Now let's move to analysis of the translational issues in our pericope. First, we see minor word choice variation occurring in the 12 different translations that we reviewed. Many of these variations reflect simple word choice rather than issues of theological significance. And we show a couple of examples here. Uh, the first around the verse 3, which talks about making straight in the desert a highway for our God, yet other translations call that a wasteland or a wilderness. And then again in verse 19, where there's discussion of an idol, there's variations in the way that the creation of that idol is described. Thin layer of gold, a veneer of gold, a plate of gold, or decorated with silver, draped with silver filigree or silver chains. And these two are word variations, although within those we don't see a lot of theological significance. We do see some theological significance in the general language style used in each Bible. The King James Bible, for example, uses an Old English style. And the Message Bible uses more of a modern vernacular. The intent of that Bible is to make it readable for the common man and even for children so that it's very easy to understand. Looking at an example from within our pericope, chapter 40, verse 1, the King James Bible says, comfort ye, my people, saith your God. Whereas the Message Bible says, comfort, O comfort my people, says your God. And the New American Bible Revised Edition says, comfort, give comfort to my people, says your God. The style of the language really impacts the feeling of the verse, and the Old English makes it feel a little more distant or less comfortable, whereas the modern vernacular does make it feel more commonplace or everyday. And we'll see this in another passage on the next slide as well. In this second example, in chapter 40, verse 13, we again see how the goal in the translation affects the interpretation. So the King James Bible, written in Old English, states, who hath directed the Spirit of the Lord, or being his counselor hath taught him? Whereas the Message Bible said, who could ever have told God what to do or taught him his business? You can see that the Old English can seem very formal and difficult to relate to, while the modern vernacular of the Message Bible has the appearance or feeling of maybe being less majestic or less reverent, and has the effect of making God appear maybe less divine or more like everyday man. So in our pericope, the translation reflected various feelings or sentiments about how one could um, interpret the appearance of God, um, and the level of divinity or reverence that we're giving him.
And now we will provide a detailed analysis of our passage. Our passage begins, "Comfort, O comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem and cry to her. She has served her term, that her penalty is paid, that she has received from the Lord's hand double for her sins." The passage opens with a command to bring hope and comfort to God's people. When it states, "my people," focuses on a reaffirmation that God is a God of the people. He is their God, and they are his people, an idea that had been lost during the exile. It conveys the message that while God can personally bring about punishment based on sin and wrongdoing, now is a time for subsequent relief. God declares that Jerusalem is forgiven. The penalty or price has been paid. Though the text refers to a double payment, it does not necessarily refer to an actual doubling of punishment. It may, however, refer to the fact that Jerusalem does not owe more debt, to reassure the reader that there is an end of purifying sorrow. There is no question that the price has been paid in full. It is not to imply divine anger. Voice cries out, "In the wilderness prepare the way of the Lord. Make straight in the desert a highway for our God. Every valley shall be lifted up, and every mountain and hill be made low. The uneven ground shall become level, and the rough places a plain. And the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all people shall see it together, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken." The text points to the end of Zion's desolation and exile through the appearance and glory of God. The voice that cries out proclaims a message that it is appropriate for all creation, a message meant for Jerusalem and for all people who shall see it together. The last line, "For the mouth of the Lord has spoken," may indicate that the voice is repeating words already given, indicating that the hand of God extends beyond Israel, salvation for all. A voice says, "Cry out." And I said, "What shall I cry?" All people are grass. Their constancy is like a flower in the field. The grass withers, the flower fades. When the breath of the Lord blows upon it, surely the people are grass. The grass withers, the flower fades. But the word of our God will stand forever. These verses speak of the fact that humanity, which is likened to grass, can fade and wither. It states a two-sided implication of God's spoken word. The first being a harsh judgment that can wreak an awesome ruling on humanity. The second being his word that endures forever will be the power that upholds his creation. The only foundation of hope is through the eternal word of God, a message that is announced not only to those who lost their homeland in relationship with the Lord, but to all God's people. Up to the high mountain, O Zion, herald of good tidings, lift up your voice with strength. O Jerusalem, herald of good tidings, lift it up, do not fear. Say to the cities of Judah, here is your God. See, the Lord God comes with might, and his arm rules for him. His reward is with him, and his recompense before him. He will feed his flock like a shepherd. He will gather the lambs in his arms, and carry them in his bosom, and gently lead the mother sheep. Comfort promised is called out to the people of Zion. This is God's own decision to reclaim her. God's children will return to their land. God's might will be their shield, and he can lead his people with care of a shepherd. The prophet uses the imagery of lambs and nursing mothers to maintain that God is a shepherd who watches over his flock. Who has measured the waters in the hollow of his hand, and marked off the heavens with a span, and closed the dust of the earth in a measure, and weighed the mountains in scales, and the hills in a balance? Who has directed the Spirit of the Lord, or as his counselor has instructed him? Whom did he consult for his enlightenment? And who taught him the path of justice? Who taught him knowledge, and showed him the way of understanding? While verses 1 through 11 primarily focused on Jerusalem, these next verses shift the focus to the exiles in Babylon. This passage illustrates that it is Yahweh who is superior to all other nations and gods. He is control of the current situation of Babylon. We see a series of questions. These questions have a confrontational edge to them, which is different than the prior section. Many of the questions are introduced by who, with the implicit answer of Yahweh. Each of the nations are like a drop from a bucket, and are counted as dust on the scales. See, he takes up the isles like fine dust. Lebanon would not provide fuel enough, nor are its animals enough for a burnt offering. All the nations are as nothing before him. They are accounted by him as less than nothing and emptiness. These verses also point to the nothingness of the earthly nations. Human power, which is formed in rulers and kings, is before God's will mere vapor. God's purposeful creative act fills this void. To whom then will you liken God? Or what likeness compare with him? An idol? A workman casts it, and a goldsmith overlays it with gold, and casts for it silver chains. As a gift one chooses mulberry wood, wood that will not rot, and seeks out a skilled artisan to set up an image that will not topple. Here the problem of idolatry is used to indicate that there is no other than the one true Lord, one who is without equal. This section illustrates the exiled Israelites contemplating the adoption of a Babylonian god. It has an undertone of accusation and sarcasm, utilizing idols as imagery. It suggests that the people may have been considering the idea. It seems to provide a strong admonishment against it. Have you not known? Have you not heard? Has it not been told you from the beginning? Have you not understood from the foundations of the earth? It is he who sits above the circle of the earth, and its inhabitants are like grasshoppers, who stretches out the heavens like a curtain, and spreads them like a tent to live in, who brings princes to naught, and makes the rulers of the earth as nothing. Scarcely are they planted, scarcely sown, scarcely has their stem taken root in the earth, when he blows upon them and they wither, and the tempest carries them off like stubble. The final passage starts with additional questions. This time, it points out what people are to remember. Remember, all these things have been told from the very beginning. Remember, the nations are created by God and are under his authority. No king can claim equality with God. The rulers of the earth are temporary, but our God is permanent. The imagery in these verses reflects the sovereignty and majesty of Yahweh as he sits above the world with us as mere grasshoppers. His sovereignty is not detached, but plays an active role in the present reality of the exilic nation. The last verse can be likened to the fate of Assyria, as an example of God's might and of his presence. Assyria, who once oversaw God's justice regarding Israel, was cut off by the terrifying power of the Lord. Now we will provide a synthesis of our evidence. Our thesis states, the passage proclaims a salvific message of comfort and hope to reaffirm God's power to the nation that has lost its homeland and relationship with the Lord. Written in 540 BC by a prophet during the time of the Babylonian exile and speaking to a people in exile, the passage includes two units. The first unit expresses words of comfort and hope to the people remaining in Jerusalem that God is returning. Through various voices, we hear God's message that the people should make straight the path that leads from Babylon to Jerusalem because God is returning. Words bring the hope of moving from the former tragic events of the exile to the new situation that will occur for Judah. In the second unit, the theme of God's sovereign power is highlighted with rhetorical questions that emphasize that God is indeed in charge and that people and nations are under his control. Those exiled had begun to think that God's hand was less powerful than the forces and powers that controlled the fall and exile of the Judeans. The message stresses that nothing created has power over the one true God.
So, one way to connect this pastorally is that our passage, Isaiah chapter 40, verses 1 through 24, can be applied to people who are returning to the church after having left the church. No matter what, God continues to provide comfort and hope despite the sins they have committed, and God welcomes them home. Our connection to our exegesis is that the proclamation of a salvific message of comfort and hope to a people who has lost its relationship with the Lord. Another pastoral approach is currently our church is in exile. This is due to the problems the church has experienced, such as the sexual abuse scandals, and also due to a changing culture of materialism, individualism, and relativism. Isaiah provides a message of comfort and hope, and our exegesis connection to this pastoral implication is that the exiles in Babylon experienced an exodus where they returned from a foreign land to Jerusalem. This mirrors the exodus of Moses and the people from Egypt. Our final implication can be one that is a theological implication. So, despite all the difficult and challenging times, both at a personal level and at a larger national and global levels, God is in charge. God will provide for us in the ways that He sees fit. And so, our exegesis connection to this theological implication is that God holds a sovereign power above all nations and all creation. No matter what, God is in charge.
So in summary, our goal was to provide support and explanation of our thesis that the passage proclaims a salvific message of comfort and hope and affirms God's sovereign power to a nation that has lost its homeland and its relationship with the Lord. Through our analysis, we've shown that Isaiah 40 verses 1 through 24 was written in approximately 540 BC during the time of the Babylonian exile. It was written to two populations, both the exiles in Babylon as well as those remaining in Jerusalem, and did in fact proclaim comfort and hope. And the hope is that God is again returning to the people of Israel after an extended period of perceived absence. Amidst the destruction and exile that occurred in Jerusalem, it provides a message that God is, in fact, in control of all creation and all nations. It didn't seem so for a while during that period, which was so severely destructive to the people. But the passage proclaims the message that God is indeed in control. The passage also includes Exodus imagery, talking about a people wandering in a foreign land before finally returning back to Jerusalem. And that Exodus imagery really develops a comparison between the Babylonian exiles and the people of the Exodus wandering in the wilderness. Certainly, the passage also includes imagery about idols and a warning against the worship of idols. This was a risk for the exiles who lived among a foreign people who worshipped foreign idols, and as newcomers to that culture, it's a risk that they adopt the culture themselves. And so the passage warns against the worship of idols and um, advises towards the worship of the one true God. It also utilizes forms and tools that creates scenes that are somewhat ill-defined or um, the speakers and listeners are sort of vaguely defined, and that allows the context of the situation to be broadened to include other situations or contexts to which it might be applied. And this allows for application to a variety of both pastoral and personal situations. In summary, the passage really is about comfort, hope, that God is returning, God is the one true God, and God is in control of all creation and all nations. The message really is supportive and reassuring. God is with us always, even if we don't necessarily see it or understand it at the time. God is always with us. That concludes our analysis. We hope you've enjoyed our presentation.